My name is Charles Shaw. I'm from the United States. I currently live in the Bay Area, Oakland, California, soon to be moving to the Pacific Northwest. I'm an author and a filmmaker and a journalist. I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm the author of a book called Exile Nation, Drugs, Prisons, Politics, and Spirituality, which really forms the basis of all the work that I do. And since I wrote that book, which kind of chronicles my experience as a drug war victim, a drug war prisoner, and ultimately a drug war activist, the whole kind of transformation that I went through getting caught up in America's criminal justice system as someone with a drug problem, part of that whole process also led to a kind of a, political and spiritual awakening. And so that has kind of like permeated into all of the work that I do these days. I like to deal in social justice issues, so I created a documentary series called the Exile Nation Project, and that focuses on the drug war and 40 years of oral history testimony from people who, across the spectrum, who've been involved in it. And then after that, I spent 2.5 years on the Mexican border in Tijuana, filming people who had immigrated to the United States and then found themselves being deported without any hope of return to their families or their homes. So they're living homeless in the sewers and in the streets of Tijuana. It was a pretty harrowing experience. It's called The Plastic People. And we're just about to release that into the commercial market this year. The title of my talk is Consciousness and Revolution. And it's the 4th version in a series that I'm giving. Each version is kind of tailored towards a different audience and a different crowd and a different set of beliefs. This one is looking at an alternate world history of consciousness, conflict, war, and revolution. And what it does is it kind of charts this history of conscious awakenings, particularly in the Western world. And the premise of the talk is that all revolutions begin as a revolution of consciousness, and that the history of the world could easily be described as the history of revolution, or the history of kind of static interplay between, power and between classes of power. I'm taking a look at history from a broad perspective of what is the history of revolution, what does revolution mean, and what leads to revolutions. And so I look at a few other periods of awakening where various sections of the population became conscious of their situation and decided that they didn't really jive with it, and they had some grievances, and that they wanted to take issue and make change. So a lot of the great movements of history are born out of that. Some of the previous awakenings in American history were the Puritan awakening, where they realized that they wanted to live without being persecuted for their religious beliefs, and so they had to come across the ocean and start a whole nother colony just to be able to live as themselves. There was an evangelical awakening that happened in the middle of the 1800s, where spirituality became the kind of driving force, both in the the colonization of the continent, but also in this idea of people breaking away from, the old order and entering into the industrial era, which then led to another awakening, which is primarily anarchistic in general. This is around the turn of the century, where the industrial world suddenly presented all of its problems and all of its class issues, and people started to organize around that. And women started to organize the early feminist movement. And so you have, this constant lineage of change and awakening and change and awakening that has powered all of the social movements of our time. And then, of course, there's a repressive back force, that stands against it, that doesn't want to concede power, that doesn't want to let change happen. And therefore, they too are continually updating their tactics and practices in their own consciousness of oppression, right, to make sure that the revolution either fails or is somehow co-opted. And so we look at this kind of pattern over time and see, or maybe don't see, maybe we just ask the question, has this been successful? Like, what type of material success has society really gained through this paradigm? And then that kind of leads us into this larger question of today and where we are today, and this notion of the spiritual revolution. It's something that I heard for the first time maybe 10 years ago, when I was involved in political organizing, direct action stuff, shutting down things because we opposed them. And after getting beat up by the police and breathing tear gas and these things for enough times, you start to question, is this really getting us anywhere? And in my, pursuit of trying to find another way, I would hear this, well, we need to have a spiritual revolution. And I was coming from a secular materialist world. I, thought, God, spiritual, I don't really, well, and I didn't really get it. It took me a number of years and a very long path, which ultimately is charted in my book and my other work, that brought me to the understanding of what that spiritual revolution is. And so now what I try to do is help shape people's understanding of it just by sharing my own personal experience, what it means to me, and what I kind of brought out of it, the next level of awakening, you could say, that I had as a person, and that I also see like millions of people around me going through at the same time. It's an uncertain time. It's somewhat frightening and stressful for people, and so I think that there needs to be some kind of structure and security given to people in the positive sense. Not the type of security that our governments are offering us, but a sense of personal security about what's happening, and that it's all part of a larger process. So there's many questions to be raised in this whole thing, because so much of the areas that we navigate in are non-tangible. I mean, how do you measure a spiritual revolution or a spiritual awakening? And how do you talk about a largely covert system of repression around it that doesn't acknowledge its own existence, right? A lot of gray intangibles to play with. That's why I like the Open Mind Conference, because it's one of those places where we can actually take intangibles and try to make them concrete and breathe some life into them as science, as opposed to just speculation. We were talking earlier outside about the differences between Northern Europe and America, and in the course of the conversation it kind of became clear that there was a lot of misperception about what the United States is really about and what its reality is at the present moment. And I guess to answer a question of, well, what's it really like, I suppose I would point to 20 years ago, before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and what our perception of the Soviet Union was versus what the reality was. So most people in America at that time had this idea of the great evil empire, this gigantic Soviet military machine that was hell-bent on destroying the world. What we didn't realize was that there were people standing in line for hours for a loaf of bread or for food, and that there was, energy shortages, and people didn't have what they needed, and the Soviet Union did all that they could to make sure that the world didn't see that. They didn't want people to see that they were being deprived. But slowly it became obvious, and ultimately that was the tipping point. When people had to escape a prison in Berlin that they were packed into, you knew that the system wasn't working. The United States is a gigantic Berlin Wall right now. I mean, we have gigantic walls covering both of our borders. We are keeping people in. We aren't just trying to keep people out. We have 310 million people, and they are all collateral to our central bank, which is collapsing at the moment. And ultimately, we're all going to have to pay that bill. So what's happened is that we have, a realistic 20% unemployment, not an 8.4% unemployment. And that's because the government chooses to cherry pick statistics in order to benefit their overall agenda. I explained it by saying that you only get counted in the statistics if you were in the system, and not everybody's in the system. So if you had a full-time job with benefits and you were paying your taxes, and then you got fired from that job and went and applied for unemployment insurance and got it, then you're in the system, you're a statistic. Well, most people are existing outside of that these days. Most people are having to work part-time jobs, 3 and 4 of them, just to survive. They aren't getting government assistance. They don't have health insurance. There's almost 50 million people without it. The Obama administration passed a health plan, which is, it didn't really change anything on its surface. And then before they could implement it, our Congress is making sure to defund it. So, there's really no change going on. What we have is a a one-party system masquerading as a two-party system. They have very little actual substantive differences. They're pretty much the same empirically. They stand for the same economic, military, and foreign policies. We have, over the last 12 years, very rapidly and in a very terrifying manner, turned the United States into a police state. Liken it to the way that a sprinkler system is set up in a skyscraper. You know, you integrate the sprinkler system into the architecture, into the engineering, and you build it into the system. But it doesn't do anything. It just sits there. It sits there above you, doing nothing, waiting for the right moment. But as soon as that emergency moment hits, it turns on, and it turns off the fire. Some people call it turnkey totalitarianism, the idea that you can turn it on and turn it off. I mean, that's the best way to look at it. And so it's nefarious, and it's hidden, and it's not overt. It isn't wearing jackboots and marching down the street. It's hiding in business suits and advertising and buzzwords and a lot of propaganda. And what we have is a population that is in the throes of the psychosis created by cognitive dissonance, you know, where they're holding two realities, and every day they see a new reality. They see, you know, families being tasered by police over nothing, over minor traffic incidents. They're seeing old people being killed by riot police, 95-year-old men, for refusing to go to the hospital. They're seeing on order of 30,000 armed raids a year with SWAT teams, many of them to the wrong addresses, many of them coming in shooting animals, people, anything in their way. I mean, checkpoints all along a 100-mile buffer zone around every border with impunity. I mean, little things like these times 1,000 and 1,000 are happening all across the country. And they don't get reported in the news. They get little bits and pieces of local news, and social media passes them around. And then they get warped through the whole lens of social media, so people put their own spins on it, and disinformation and bad. And so nothing, you can't really hold on to anything as truth anymore. I mean, everything that we're hearing from the government turns out to be lies. Everything we're hearing from the media turns out to be lies. And we're finding ourselves now that we've spent so much time away from each other, in front of our computers and in these little cubicles of life, that we don't really know whether we trust each other anymore. Or we don't know how to trust each other anymore. And so everybody's talking about community this and community that, but there's very few communities except the ones that have been around, the traditional smaller communities that have been around forever and that are still trying to hang on to their very existence. It's difficult to talk about community in urban settings with transient populations, you know, because they rarely build true community. I spent 7 years in a kind of a countercultural meme in the States on the West Coast, dealing with people in the progressive sustainability and the festival culture, artistic cultures. And there was a lot of, you know, belief in these communities that we were doing something unique, or we were pioneers, that we were way ahead of the curve because we were the next generation of the consciousness revolution. You know, our parents were the pioneering hippies that, you know, broke ground, and here we are, you know, with all of their lessons on the vanguard of the new movement, except there's no movement, you know. There's a lot of entrepreneurialism, there's a lot of turning green technology, and I mean both environmental and cannabis technology, into billions, but I don't see a lot of true community, and I don't see a lot of, you know, political activity going on. That's what makes up largely the substance and the critique in my talk, is this idea of where is our political consciousness right now, and why is the United States asleep while the rest of the world is exploding in protest. I mean, even, you know, by comparison, Europe and America, it's like, you know, one is in a coma and the other is screaming. You know, it's very clear distinction between the two, and yet we are supposed to be sharing a culture together. You know? So I think that there's a particular kind of psychosis in the United States, and it's being projected out to the rest of the world. Certainly it's not just our leaders, because our leaders have created such a sense of confusion that that psychosis is just being picked up by everybody else. At some point, the world's not going to put up with it anymore. And I'm afraid that most Americans aren't really aware of what's going on or what's going to happen to us. So I have grave, grave concerns, if not outright fear, of what's going to happen just in the very immediate future. Part of what I'm trying to do is in my own small way, because I don't really feel like I have, the kind of influence to change it, but I feel like in some way it's my obligation to try to wake up as many people as possible. You gotta shake them, pull the Three Stooges routine, pull their nose and poke their eyes out or whatever, just to get them to wake up and see what's going on. So there is this theory that if 10% of us wake up, just 10%, that we'll be able to tip the whole thing. And if it's, the right 10%, the people that are coming from the heart, and I don't mean the smartest or the prettiest or the richest. I mean the people that truly are coming, energetically from the right place. I think we're skirting, surfing, skiing the top of that right now, and we're so, so close. So, now is the time really to double, triple, quadruple our efforts and to really push, because the madness is never going to stop until we stop it. And here's the big secret, and this is what I reveal, and I don't reveal it because it's totally obvious, but sometimes people just need to be reminded of it. There are so many more of us than there are of them. I mean, like 1,000,000 to 1. It's ridiculous, and they know this, and they know that all of us are waking up. It's not just educated Europeans, it's Brazilians, it's Angolans, it's Indians, it's Cypriots, it's Australians. Everybody's waking up right now. And as soon as that one spark hits, that one spark that starts that big prairie fire, that's when we're going to see things change. I think they're going to plunge us into a lot of really bad stuff to try to stop it. But I think it's all just the same. It's all part of the same process that's working itself out right now. There's a lot of literature in a specific book I point to a lot of times called The Fourth Turning. It's a sociological analysis of the pretty much Western civilization with a specific focus on Anglo-American history. It looks at the 1500s until today. And what it parsed out was this regular 80-year cycle. It's called a saeculum, about the span of a human life. And each of us is born into a generation and a generational archetype. So I'm what's known as a Generation X, or a 13er, the 13th American generation, or the X generation, because we weren't supposed to amount to anything. My parents are known as baby boomers, or the silent generation. So we each have a generation, we each have an archetype to this generation. And this 80-year generation, or saeculum, is broken into 4 segments of 20 years. And each of those 20 years represents what a society goes through in that 80 years. So there's a high, where they're at their peak, and all of the institutions and practices and beliefs of the society are at their highest potential, and everyone's believing in it. And then there comes an awakening period, another 20 years. And we start to question and see new things and see problems and say, well, we're not entirely sure that this great system is what's going to work now. So then the awakening leads to rebellion usually, which comes in the form of what's known as an unraveling then. And then they unravel the society bit by bit, factioning off into different opposing groups. And lastly, the society enters the crisis phase. And the crisis phase is when everything comes to a head. Without fail, back to the 1500s, they have parsed out that every 80 years or so, there's a major economic collapse and a major war. And the Great War period and the Great Depression period was the last one, and before that was the American Civil War period, and before that was the American Revolutionary War period, and before that was the French and Indian War, and War of the Roses, going all the way back. So if we know that all of this, the history of the world is the history of revolution. There is this revolution that goes regularly. if you know that every day at 12 o'clock you're going to get fed, then as Pavlov showed, you'll start to salivate. What we need is for people to start salivating for this change period, to know that it's coming, and to know that there's nothing that's going to stop it. So we've got to either play the right role or we have to play the wrong role. And I'm just hoping that I'm on the right side. I don't know. I think I am. Feels right. And it seems to think right, but who knows?